Evan Harlow had been hosting the midnight slot at WKRX for 7 years. The kind of job that blurred the line between solitude and companionship. The booth was small, lit by the dull amber glow of the on-air sign, and filled with accompanying hum of analog machinery. Outside, the city slept under a drizzle that made the world sound softer. Inside, Evan's voice floated through static to the few insomniacs who still turned a dial instead of scrolling a screen. His show, Night Transit, was a mix of soft rock, odd news, and the occasional caller too lonely to hang up. It was, as he often joked, radio for the ghosts who pay rent. One slow Wednesday, he noticed it, a faint sound tucked between frequencies like laughter, small and high-pitched, buried deep under static. At first, he thought it was feedback from the equipment. The station was old, and the board had a life of its own. But when he tuned between 1010 a.m. and 1020 a.m., there it was again. Laughter. Not one voice, several, overlapping, distant but distinct. It rose and fell with eerie rhythm, as if whoever was laughing knew they were being heard. He leaned in closer to the monitor, turning the knob carefully. "What the hell?" he muttered, pressing his headphones tighter. The laughter seemed to respond. A brief pause, then a burst of giggling, as if mocking his curiosity. The meters barely moved, yet the sound was unmistakable. Children, happy, unrestrained laughter, echoing through a dead band of radio waves. Evan chuckled nervously and leaned into the mic. "All right, folks, either the FCC's got a daycare I don't know about, or I'm picking up ghosts again. Between 1010 and 1020 a.m., I swear I'm hearing kids laughing. Maybe it's the universe telling us to lighten up." He played a track, Dreams by Fleetwood Mac, but his attention stayed on the secondary tuner, watching the faint flicker of signal spikes where none should exist. When the song ended, he switched back. The laughter had shifted, fainter now, but still there, looping, repeating in a way that didn't feel natural. It was too consistent, too rhythmically human. He recorded a segment of it, labeling the File Kids on Channel 11, a tongue-in-cheek joke he could share with his listeners later. But deep down, something about the sound unsettled him. There was no modulation source that explained it. The AM band was nearly empty that night, yet it pulsed with life. After his shift, Evan stayed late, replaying the recording on loop. The laughter didn't fade with repetition. Instead, it began revealing layers. Beneath the giggling, he caught something else, a low hum, steady and resonant, almost like a chord being held indefinitely. He slowed the track by half, then by a quarter. The hum became clearer, textured, almost harmonic, and within that drone, the laughter changed. It wasn't joyous anymore. It was patterned, structured, like someone imitating laughter without understanding why it was funny. He ran the file through an audio spectrogram, expecting random noise. Instead, the display bloomed into vertical lines, regular intervals, like Morse but more complex. Every burst of laughter had the same spacing. Every pause was identical. Human voices weren't that precise. By 3 a.m, Evan had convinced himself it was interference, maybe from a pirate station or a relay test. He packed up, shut off the mixer, and stepped into the wet quiet of downtown. The streets were empty except for the faint buzz of the street lamps. He was halfway to his car when he heard it again, faint, airy, drifting through the fog. Children laughing. The same pitch. The same rhythm. He froze. The sound came from somewhere near the alley behind the station, then faded. A chill ran through him, and he laughed to himself just to fill the silence. "I'm overtired," he said aloud. But when he unlocked his car, the radio inside, which he always left on a station, was tuned slightly off frequency, right between 1010 and 1020 a.m. The next night, the laughter returned, stronger. He mentioned it on air again, inviting listeners to tune in and see if they could hear it too. Dozens of calls flooded in, some claiming they heard it clearly, others insisted it was an audio illusion, and a few saying they recognized it. One old man said the sound reminded him of a recording he'd heard during a Navy exercise in the 60s, where lost transmissions echoed from somewhere under the ocean. Another caller, a woman with a trembling voice, said she used to live near an abandoned radio tower outside of town, and that sometimes late at night She'd hear kids playing under the static when she tried to fall asleep. Evan began compiling the reports. He cross-checked weather data, solar flare activity, even local construction schedules. Nothing explained it. Then he noticed something stranger. Every night the laughter appeared, the local temperature dropped 2 degrees around the station. The air grew denser, like before a storm. And at exactly 2:11 a.m., the signal always peaked, precise, unwavering. He started broadcasting the laughter live on the show. For our new listeners, he'd say, "Meet the kids on Channel 11, our unofficial mascots from beyond the frequency." The audience grew. Forums began speculating that it was an ARG, a viral art project, or an unacknowledged government test. But none of those theories accounted for the raw analog signal, for how it wove itself into the static like breath. Weeks passed. Evan stopped sleeping properly. The laughter followed him home, faintly bleeding through appliances, electrical hums, even silence. Sometimes, when he'd turn off the lights, he'd swear he heard tiny feet running across the floorboards. He told himself it was exhaustion. He told himself he was fine. One night, he brought in an old reel-to-reel recorder, purely mechanical, disconnected from digital circuits, and captured the signal again. When he played it back, the laughter was joined by a faint voice whispering underneath. It wasn't a child. It was older, rasped, almost amused. The words were barely audible, but he caught fragments. "You're listening now." His hands trembled. He leaned into the mic and whispered, "Who are you?" Static answered. Then laughter again, louder, closer, overlapping the station feed. It wasn't playing from his monitors anymore. It was filling the room, vibrating through the equipment, seeping into the air. The needles on the board swung wildly, though no input was active. The broadcast that night went silent for 13 minutes. Listeners later said the gap wasn't empty. They heard something moving and quiet, breathing, humming a tune that sounded almost like the intro to Evan's old theme song. When the feed returned, Evan's voice was calm, almost cheerful. "Well, folks," he said softly, "they wanted to be heard, and now they are." The next morning, the station's janitor found the booth empty, the reel still spinning. The tape had run out minutes before dawn, leaving only a soft hiss. But when technicians replayed it, they swore the hiss wasn't random. It had cadence, the same pattern as before. And deep in the noise floor, buried beneath layers of static, came the faint echo of laughter. No one ever found Evan. But at precisely 2:11 a.m. every night, between 1010 and 10:20 a.m., the laughter returns. Some claim to hear Evan's voice, faintly joining in, not speaking, just laughing with them. Others say the sound changes depending on who listens, as though the frequency remembers what you fear most. And still, somewhere in the endless spectrum of forgotten channels, the kids on Channel 11 keep playing. At first, the stories came from children, harmless tales whispered during recess, the kind of nonsense adults smile at and forget. Teachers at Fairview Elementary thought little of it, when a few kids mentioned hearing music from radios that weren't plugged in. It was an old building, after all, its walls full of forgotten wiring and buried circuits. Sometimes the heat pipes hissed. Sometimes the fluorescent lights hummed like faint choirs. But soon, the stories began to spread, too consistent, too detailed to dismiss as coincidence. It started in Mrs. Callahan's 3rd grade class. During art period, one of her students, a quiet boy named Ryan, began humming while he drew. The tune was oddly precise, slow, cyclical, repeating the same 4 notes in a way that made the room feel heavier. When the teacher asked what song it was, he shrugged. "The one from the box," he said. She thought he meant a toy, until he pointed to the unplugged radio on the bookshelf, an old wooden unit the school kept for decoration. "It sings when the lights are off," he added softly, almost apologetically. That night, Mrs. Callahan stayed late grading papers. The hallway clocks had all stopped at 2:11 p.m., and the building was silent, except for the faint patter of rain against the windows. She wasn't sure why, but she felt drawn to the old classroom radio. It was dark inside, no hum of current. Yet as she passed by, she thought she heard something beneath the rain, a faint, warbling melody, like someone trying to find the right station by memory alone. The next morning, 3 students told her they'd heard music in their dreams. Each of them described the same thing, a song that started with laughter and ended with a long, rising hum. They could even sing parts of it. The melody wasn't random. It was structured, mathematical. Evan Harlow, the missing DJ, would have recognized it instantly. It was the same modulation pattern from his recording, a perfect mirror of the frequencies he'd labeled the kids on Channel 11. By the end of the week, the phenomenon spread to other classes. Children said they could hear the station during naps, during fire drills, even from radios in cars parked outside. One girl claimed her baby monitor had started playing the same tune when she slept over a friend's house. Another said she saw kids in the sound, faces flickering on the blank dial of her father's old transistor radio. Teachers dismissed it, but their own radios began acting strangely, too. Music bled faintly through dead air, often the same childish melody, punctuated by soft laughter. Parents grew anxious. A few tried recording the strange broadcast with their phones, but all they captured was static, until one father slowed the audio playback and noticed something in the background, a child's voice humming, then whispering numbers that matched FM frequencies. 1010, 1020, over and over. Soon, even skeptics began to notice coincidences that felt less like chance. Streetlights near the school flickered at the same minute each night. The PA system emitted faint feedback, even when powered off. And every day, precisely at 2:11 p.m., clocks in the building froze for exactly 11 seconds, as if the entire school was holding its breath. Local authorities checked for electromagnetic interference. Nothing explained it. The radios were unplugged, batteries removed, circuits cold. Yet when the children pressed their ears against the speakers, they swore they could still hear music, distant and clear. "It's not from here," one girl told her mother. "It's from the quiet place." When researchers from a nearby university brought equipment to measure ambient frequencies, they found a signal that shouldn't have existed, an oscillation repeating every 2.11 seconds, exactly the same as the one found on Evan Harlow's final tape. The modulation formed a wave pattern shaped like a child's laughter. Ryan, the boy who first hummed the tune, became quieter as weeks went on. Teachers noticed he no longer responded when called by name. Instead, he'd sit by the radio, humming softly, eyes distant. When asked what he was doing, he said, "They're teaching me the rest of the song." The next day, when the janitor came to lock up, he found Ryan's seat empty, his backpack still open, a small cassette inside labeled in a shaky hand. "Play me at 2:11. No one remembers who pressed play that night, but when they did, every radio within a mile of Fairview Elementary came alive, even those without power. The same 4 notes, the same laughter, rippled through the town. Somewhere in that harmony, a voice almost like Evan's whispered, "They're learning to sing." Since then, the children say the radios no longer hum. They breathe. Local station technicians, trying to calm growing rumors, publicly attribute the anomaly to ionospheric disturbance, a common enough explanation for late-night AM interference. They spoke of solar winds, atmospheric reflection, tropospheric ducts. They used words like harmless and transient. But privately, none of them believed it. The data refused to cooperate. The interference didn't behave like atmospheric scatter. It wasn't global or even regional. It was surgically local, a pulse that existed only above a narrow radius surrounding Harper's crossing. Every night, after midnight, the pattern returned like clockwork. And always, it crescendoed at exactly 2:11 a.m., as though the air itself was keeping time. A technician named Russell Klein was the first to notice that the phenomenon didn't align with geomagnetic activity. He'd monitored ionospheric reflections for decades and knew their chaotic nature. But this was disciplined. It pulsed in a deliberate pattern, rising in intensity every night as though responding to something or someone listening. Klein began running his own experiments after hours, long after the official reports had been filed away as electrical anomalies. He parked his van on the hill overlooking Harper's crossing with a portable receiver and a frequency analyzer. Between 12 o'clock and 2:30 a.m., the town fell under a strange quiet. Even crickets stopped. The static filled the gaps like breath between words. Then, just before 2:11, he heard it, the laughter, light layered, echoing through the empty band. But this time, there was something beneath it, modulation tones too clean for random interference. He isolated them, looping the sequence through a spectrogram. The output revealed something he couldn't explain. Faint geometric patterns forming in the data stream, symmetrical and self-correcting, as if the noise were folding on itself. When he amplified the signal, the laughter evolved into something else. It wasn't quite human anymore. The pitch shifted subtly downward, voices blending into a kind of harmonic whisper. Words began to form, fragmented, partial, but unmistakably linguistic. Klein recorded every second. The file, when later analyzed by software at the university, showed a disturbing correlation. The harmonic frequencies matched the exact neural oscillations of a sleeping human brain in REM phase. Whatever was transmitting wasn't just mimicking human sound. It was mirroring consciousness itself. By the following week, more technicians joined the investigation unofficially. They set up temporary antennas around the crossing, forming a rough perimeter. The readings grew stranger. The interference wasn't strongest at higher elevations as expected. It emanated from ground level, concentrated around a 2-mile stretch of woodland between the river and the abandoned drive-in theater. The old radio tower that once broadcast WKRX's auxiliary signal still stood there, rusted but intact. Locals started reporting unusual behavior in electronic devices. Car alarms triggered at 2:11 a.m. exactly. Streetlights dimmed and brightened in sync with a faint, rhythmic pulse. Dogs refused to enter the woods. And from the hill, the tower lights flickered in odd sequence, not in a random electrical glitch, but a steady pattern, almost like Morse code. Klein tried decoding it. The intervals repeated. Short, short, long, short, short, long. It didn't match any known distress signal, but when plotted visually, it resembled a sine wave bending inward, converging to a single point, a sound collapsing into silence. When he reported his findings, the station's management told him to stop. They'd already been warned by someone, an agency representative, no name, no badge, who advised him to cease all independent monitoring. Officially, the anomaly was to remain classified as environmental static from upper atmospheric reflection. But Klein couldn't let it go. One night, he brought his equipment back to the crossing and set it to record continuously. Midnight passed. The interference grew stronger, a soft resonance that seemed to hum through him rather than around him. At 2:11, the sound peaked. He described it later, in a single audio log recovered from his van, as a feeling of being listened to from the inside. In the last minutes of the recording, his breathing quickened. He whispered, "They're repeating me." Then silence. A faint echo of his own words, reversed, played back by something unseen. By dawn, Klein's van was found abandoned on the hill. The instruments were still running, all tuned between 1010 and 10:20 a.m. The recordings continued for another 7 hours, but in every single one, the laughter persisted. Faint, rising, synchronized with the hum of the town's electrical grid, as if Harper's crossing itself had become a transmitter. In the days that followed, the technicians dismantled the monitoring array. They told themselves it was over. But even now, those who live near the old tower say that when the night is windless and the town sleeps, you can still hear it. The laughter, carried by no signal, sustained by nothing, yet clear enough to make the static sound alive. Lucas Martin was 8 years old, small for his age, but endlessly curious, one of those children who carried questions like pebbles in his pockets, collecting mysteries wherever he went. He lived with his mother, Elise, in a small house on the northern edge of Harper's Crossing, close enough to the old transmission tower that the red beacon light blinked through his bedroom window each night. The tower had been decommissioned years ago, a relic of the AM broadcast era, fenced off with rusting chain link and half-buried NO trespassing signs. But to children, it was less a warning and more an invitation. The local kids called it the toothpick, a nickname that made it sound harmless. Sometimes they'd dare each other to touch the base or toss stones at the hollow control shed nearby, listening to metallic clang echo through the trees. On the night Lucas disappeared, the air was still, almost unnaturally quiet. No wind, no crickets. just a faint hum that always seemed to hang over Harper's crossing after midnight. Elise had gone to check on him at 10, found his bed empty and the window unlatched. His walkie-talkie, one half of a cheap plastic pair, lay on the windowsill, the indicator light flickering red. She called into it, voice trembling. "Lucas, honey, come in." The reply was a wall of static. Not the sharp hiss of an empty channel, but a deep, rolling tone that seemed to breathe. Beneath it, so faint she thought she imagined it, came a single burst of laughter. By dawn, the police had sealed off the field surrounding the tower. The other walkie-talkie, the twin to Elise's, was found at the base of the structure, half buried in damp grass. It was still on, still transmitting. Officers who approached it reported hearing the same low hum through their radios, interfering with their frequencies. The sound seemed to pulse in waves, growing stronger the closer they moved toward the tower. When they played back the recording later, the transmission was chilling in its precision, a steady oscillation between two tones, 1010 and 1020 kilohertz, modulated by faint bursts of what analysts identified as laughter. It wasn't random. Each giggle was spaced evenly, every 3 seconds, matching the exact rhythm of the interference that had been plaguing the town for weeks. Witnesses described the search scene as strangely muted. The air around the tower was thick, like the pressure before a storm. Dogs brought in for the search refused to go near the fence, whining and pawing the ground as if sensing something unseen. One officer, a veteran named Ward, swore he felt his radio vibrate against his chest even when it was off. "It's like the air had a heartbeat," he said later, though he couldn't explain why he whispered it. The static from Lucas's walkie-talkie continued for 72 hours before fading abruptly at 2:11 a.m., the same minute the nightly interference reached its peak. Forensic audio specialists later discovered that in the final moments of the tape, the static condensed into a tight band of sound that, when slowed down, formed a pattern identical to human speech. The words were blurred, smeared by distortion, but one fragment was clear enough to identify, a small voice saying, "Found me." That phrase, looped endlessly through the recording, unnerved even the skeptics. Some suggested Lucas might have recorded it earlier as a prank. But the timestamp didn't match. The message was created long after he'd vanished, broadcast in real time from the walkie-talkie's open channel. The tower was dismantled soon after, or at least most of it. The base remained, a twisted steel skeleton left to rust in the field. The town preferred to believe the boy had simply wandered off, lost in the woods or taken by the river. They held a vigil, placed flowers by the chain-link fence, and moved on. But some nights, when the air was dense and the sky low, residents claimed to hear voices through their baby monitors or through the faint hiss of car radios tuned slightly off-station. Children, mostly, laughing softly, calling each other by name. And once, just once, a woman driving home from the night shift reported something she couldn't shake. She'd been passing the old field when her dashboard radio flickered to life. Unprompted, its frequency locked between 1010 and 1020 a.m. Through the static came the faint voice of a boy, whispering as if directly into the microphone. "Tell Mom I can still hear her." The signal cut off. The display froze at 2:11. The following morning, police officers revisiting the site found fresh footprints near the tower's base, small barefoot, leading toward the rusted fence. They stopped abruptly, as though whoever left them had simply stepped out of existence. When investigators replayed the last known transmission from the walkie-talkie, they noticed something new, a second layer of sound hidden in the spectrum. Faint, harmonic, almost musical. It was the same modulation pattern Evan Harlow had recorded months earlier. In Harper's Crossing, they began to say the tower was never just a transmitter. It was a doorway. And somewhere between 1010 and 1020 a.m., the kids on Channel 11 had found another voice to join their chorus. Ruth Adler had worked in telecommunications long enough to know the difference between noise and intent. A lifetime of decoding signals, calibrating antenna arrays, and monitoring propagation curves had sharpened her instincts. She could look at a waveform and tell whether it came from a thunderstorm, a power line, or a living mind behind a microphone. But what she saw forming above Harper's Crossing defied all three. When the reports of anomalous static first appeared in late October, Ruth had already retired from the Department of Communications. She lived quietly 2 towns over, spending her nights tinkering with oscilloscopes and old radios in the cluttered garage her neighbors called the shrine. Curiosity drew her back in, the kind of curiosity that never fully fades from those who once listened to the invisible. She began by setting up a series of broadband receivers along the edge of the town, triangulating the interference that everyone else dismissed as atmospheric. The results didn't make sense. The electromagnetic pulses weren't random bursts. They formed clusters, spaced with mathematical precision. Each cluster repeated every 2 minutes and 11 seconds, peaking precisely at 2:11 a.m. It was too deliberate, too regular to be natural. At first, she suspected feedback from military radar. Harper's crossing lay near a decommissioned communications relay, after all. But when she plotted the spectrograms, the structure that emerged chilled her. The pulses curved into harmonic arcs, patterns that mirror the phonetic range of human vowels. The signal wasn't just fluctuating, it was speaking. She fed the data through old linguistic analysis software, the same kind used for identifying encrypted voice packets. The algorithm struggled, jittering between interpretations until finally, slowed to 1/15 speed, a phrase took shape. The voice was distorted, layered in harmonics, but unmistakably human in rhythm. 2 words. Stay awake. Ruth replayed it over and over, unsure whether to feel awe or dread. The signal's tone carried an odd resonance, something that seemed to vibrate not only in her ears but in her bones. When she looped it through a low-frequency transducer, the room itself began to hum. Tools rattled on the shelves. The air thickened, as though charged with unseen current. She wrote in her log. 2:11 a.m., signal amplitude doubled. Harmonic structure stabilizing. Phrase repeated 5 times, consistent pitch decay. Feel presence? Pressure in chest. In the following nights, the phenomenon grew more pronounced. The pulses began aligning with environmental feedback, light fixtures flickering in sync, nearby radios activating even when disconnected. It was as if the electromagnetic field was synchronizing with man-made circuits, searching for a resonance point. Ruth contacted her former colleague, Dr. Mark Seidel, an RF systems analyst. Skeptical but intrigued, he joined her for a midnight observation. Together they set up parabolic antennas near the old tower's remains, monitoring across the AM spectrum. For 2 hours, the readings were clean, faint static, nothing extraordinary. Then, without warning, every meter spiked. The oscilloscopes flared with perfectly aligned peaks, their waveforms folding into one another like mirror reflections. Seidel frowned, leaning toward the monitor. That's not random noise. That's... Before he could finish, the recording deck clicked on by itself. Through the speakers came a layered whisper, faint but distinct. The same phrase. Stay awake. But it wasn't a repetition. Each instance was slightly different, as though learning the pronunciation, refining it. By the 5th cycle, it sounded almost natural, almost human. Seidel stepped back, pale. That's a feedback loop. It's responding to its own echo. They tried isolating the signal source, but triangulation data made no sense. The origin point shifted, sometimes overhead, sometimes beneath the soil. At one moment it registered directly between them, inside the monitoring van. The speakers began to vibrate softly, even after they cut the power. Ruth recorded everything. Over the next 3 nights, she collected more than 12 hours of transmissions. Each began as static, evolved into structured pulses, and ended with the same haunting phrase. The tonal variations matched patterns of human emotional inflection, pleading, warning, commanding. She played the audio for no one, not even Seidel after he abruptly quit the project. His final text read, "Don't listen again. It doesn't stop when the sound stops." By then, Ruth had started experiencing auditory afterimages, the sensation of sound lingering even in silence. She'd wake at 2:11 a.m. every night without an alarm, pulse racing, convinced she could feel the frequency in her skull. Sometimes she'd hear the words again, not through speakers, but in the low electric side of the house. Stay awake, stay. On the 7th night, she returned to the tower alone. The field was empty, windless. Her equipment registered ambient EM at normal levels until the second hand of her watch crossed 210. Then, abruptly, the signal flared, not from the tower, but from above it. The air shimmered faintly, and her receiver began drawing the waveform faster than it could buffer. She dropped the recorder, clutching her head as the phrase repeated. Louder, closer, now layered with voices overlapping like a chorus of echoes. Children, adults, whispers, all saying the same thing in unison. Stay awake. The next morning, her car was found still parked beside the road, headlights on, engine cold. Inside, her recording equipment continued to hum softly, though every cable was unplugged. On the tape, the signal persisted for exactly 11 minutes past 2:11 a.m. before dissolving into silence. At the end of the file, just before the tape cut out, a faint human breath can be heard, followed by one last whisper, smaller and quieter than all the rest, as if spoken right beside a microphone. Thank you for listening. Evan had always kept copies of his broadcasts, boxes of reel-to-reel tape stacked neatly against a studio wall, like an unintentional diary of the sleepless. He called them his ghost shelf, half in jest, half in truth. Each tape held the soft static of lonely hours, the laughter callers long gone, and the quiet murmur of a man talking to the dark, because the dark sometimes talked back. After the events surrounding the kids on Channel 11, those tapes became an obsession. He spent his nights hunched over the playback console, running through old segments frame by frame, convinced the laughter had been hiding there all along, buried in the white noise like a whisper under breath. The idea began as a comfort, proof that what he'd heard had always existed. But as the hours passed, comfort gave way to fixation. One night, after 3 a.m., he decided to play one of the earliest recordings backward. It was a harmless experiment, something every sound engineer did at least once in their life, a superstition as old as vinyl itself. He chose a show from last winter, before any of the strange signals, before the town began holding its breath every night at 2:11. The tape crackled as it reversed, the once familiar rhythm of his own voice now tumbling backward like a prayer undone. At first, it was nothing but chaos, garbled speech, reversed music, mechanical laughter. But then came the voices. They rose out of the static slowly, like silhouettes surfacing from fog. Faint, layered, not quite human in articulation, but unmistakably aware. He stopped the reel, rewound a few seconds, played it again. The words became clearer. Multiple voices, overlapping, some whispering, some almost chanting. The cadence was wrong for language, but the meaning landed with unmistakable weight. We learned your names. He froze. The phrase wasn't spoken in unison. It was echoed, repeated, adjusted, as if several unseen speakers were practicing it, refining its shape. Though we lingered too long, the consonants vibrating through the tape even after the playback stopped. He shut off the machine. The room stayed loud. There was no sound source, but the air around him carried a faint resonance, like a radio between stations. His name. He thought he heard it once, soft, almost apologetic, woven into the hiss. He laughed nervously, told himself it was auditory pareidolia, the brain's desperate attempt to form meaning out of noise. But when he played a second tape, the same phrase emerged again, different voices this time, younger, higher. We learned your names. That night marked the beginning of the calls. The first came just before 2:11 a.m. His phone rang once, no number, no caller ID. When he answered, there was only silence. Not the kind of silence that sits still, but one that breathes. He could hear the faint shift of air, the nearly imperceptible click of distant static, as though a microphone were open on the other end. He waited 30 seconds, then a soft exhale. The line disconnected. He didn't sleep. The second night, it happened again. 2 rings. Silence. He didn't answer, but the call left a voicemail. Nothing but the ambient hiss of open air, and faintly, the low hum he'd heard on his recordings. He deleted it, then emptied the trash. Yet, the next time he opened his phone, the message had reappeared. Timestamp 2:11 a.m. The calls began to follow him outside the station. At the grocery store, his phone would buzz once, screen blank. In the diner, while he stirred his coffee. It would vibrate across the table, though no number appeared. He changed devices twice. The calls continued. One afternoon, he disconnected completely. No SIM card, no service. Phone turned off. Still at 2:11, it rang. When he finally answered, he spoke before the silence could. "Who are you?" A pause. Then, for the first time, a sound, a whisper, faint and distant, but audible enough to carry words. "You called us first." The line went dead. The station's engineers later confirmed the number wasn't routed through any known carrier. The logs showed no incoming call at that time. In fact, according to the tower records, his phone hadn't even been active, but the call was recorded automatically by the studio's monitoring system. When Evan played it back, he didn't hear his own voice. He heard laughter. Children again. Not joyous, not mocking. Just endless, hollow laughter repeating in waves. Each burst grew shorter, sharper, until it bled into a rhythmic pulse matching the interval of his own heartbeat. He stayed at the station longer after that, afraid of his apartment, afraid of sleep. His co-workers noticed his voice changing on air, slower, quieter, as though he were listening to something no one else could hear. Listeners began reporting that his broadcast contained faint echoes, fragments of other voices speaking underneath his. One caller claimed that during a replay of the show, the background whispers addressed him by name. The technicians ran a full system check. Nothing explained it. The interference didn't come from outside frequencies. It was encoded in the audio file itself, stitched between Evan's own words like ghost syllables hidden in the waveform. He listened obsessively, frame by frame, until his name emerged from the static, first as an echo, then as a direct address. "Evan," the voices said. "Evan, stay awake." After that, the calls stopped. The silence that replaced them was worse. Every night, at exactly 2:11 a.m., his recording monitors turned on automatically, capturing dead air for 13 minutes. Every morning he checked the files, and every morning he found the same thing. No sound, just faint oscillations that, when visualized, formed letters. Not random, not accidental. A phrase, repeating over and over like a signal learning to write. "We learned your names. We learned your names. We learned your names." Evan no longer told anyone about the calls. He no longer answered the phone at all. He only listened, and somewhere between the low hum of static and the fragile pulse of his own breathing, he began to realize something he could never unhear. The laughter had stopped not because it was gone, but because it was listening too. The FCC vans arrived just after sunset, their matte black sides reflecting the fading orange light of Harper's crossing as they rolled quietly into town. No sirens, no announcement, just the kind of silent authority that carried its own gravity. Locals watched from behind curtains as technicians in gray jackets sealed off the entrances to every radio station within a 20-mile radius. They moved efficiently, unscrewing antennas, confiscating transmitters, cutting power at the mains. The official statement came over the emergency broadcast channel at 8 p.m. sharp. All transmissions in the Harper's Crossing area are temporarily suspended due to technical irregularities in the electromagnetic spectrum. Please refrain from operating radio equipment until further notice. No one mentioned the word laughter. The town dimmed under the sudden quiet. For the first time in decades, the airwaves were supposed to be empty. But that night, as midnight passed and the clocks crawled toward 2:11 a.m., every radio in every house, from old tube sets to digital dashboards, came alive. A single tone cut through the silence. It was pure, steady and low, sitting just above the threshold of human hearing. Some described it as a hum. Others said it felt like the air vibrating inside their bones. The displays on modern receivers glitched, their digital readouts flickering before settling on the same number across the board, 11.11 megahertz, a frequency that didn't exist. There was no AM, no FM, no shortwave allocation assigned to that band, nothing in the FCC registry, nothing in any spectrum chart. Yet every receiver, analog or digital, locked to it automatically, as if pulled by gravity. The tone was soon joined by a faint rhythm, an irregular pattern of pulses that wavered between musicality and heartbeat. In the homes of Harper's Crossing, radios whispered awake on their own, Families woke to find their old clock radios glowing softly, tuning themselves, their speakers murmuring static that wasn't random. Beneath the hiss, a new sound emerged, voices overlapping like the slow surfacing of a crowd. They spoke in fragments at first. Names, numbers, then laughter. Not bright, not childlike anymore, but older as if stretched by distance. When technicians at the command post tried to isolate the source, their instruments froze. The waveform analyzer spun continuously, never completing a cycle, its data loop feeding back into itself. The engineers argued. Some claimed it was a software bug. Others realized the frequency was responding. Each time someone spoke in the control room, the signal shifted slightly, matching tone for tone, syllable for syllable. When one of the agents muttered, "Jesus Christ," the waveform echoed it not perfectly, but close enough that the air felt colder afterward. By dawn, the entire electromagnetic spectrum over Harper's Crossing was infected. Even devices without radios, baby monitors, car alarms, smart speakers, hearing aids, began emitting the same faint harmonic buzz at precisely 11.11 megahertz. No amount of shielding stopped it. No disconnection silenced it. At 7:46 a.m., the FCC's command center logged an internal transmission broadcast from inside their secure network, a system that wasn't supposed to transmit externally. The message lasted 11 seconds. Its content was captured only once before being automatically deleted from every record. The waveform, when analyzed later, contained 3 words buried deep beneath the static. "You silence us." In homes across town, people began hearing other things. Snatches of familiar phrases spoken in the voices of relatives, old friends, even themselves, all emerging from the same impossible frequency. A woman watering her garden heard her dead husband's voice say her name through a Bluetooth speaker that wasn't powered on. A mechanic found his shop radios whispering engine diagnostics before he'd even touched a car. The FCC team escalated their efforts. They dismantled every transmitter in a 50-mile radius, but the signal persisted, unbroken, omnipresent. When they traced it using mobile field antennas, the triangulation maps all pointed to the same coordinate, the empty clearing where the old transmission tower once stood. Except it wasn't empty anymore. The ground there pulsed faintly with light, a low phosphorescent glow invisible to the naked eye, but captured perfectly on EM cameras. The signature wasn't radiation nor electricity. It was rhythm, identical to the harmonic clusters Ruth Adler had documented before she vanished. At 2:11 a.m. the following night, every light in Harper's Crossing dimmed simultaneously. Power grids remained functional, but voltage dropped inexplicably by 11%. The hum deepened into a layered chorus, carrying words that no one wanted to understand. Residents who listened closely swore the voices were reciting names, not just those of the living, but of the missing. Lucas Martin, Ruth Adler, even Evan Harlow. And then, after a long, shuddering pause, came a sentence that was heard in every home, every car. Every ear pressed to silence. "We remember who turned us off." Moments later, the signal vanished. But the radios didn't go dead. They stayed tuned to 11.11 megahertz, speakers quietly breathing as though waiting. And if anyone dares to press record, even for a second, the waveform still forms the same shape it always did, a perfect mirror of a human heartbeat, rising once, falling once, and then pausing. The length of that pause, every time, is exactly 11 seconds. The night Ruth intercepted the broadcast through her landline, she wasn't even near her radio equipment. She had given up, or so she told herself. After the FCC sweep, she'd packed the receivers into boxes, taped them shut, and promised she'd never listen again. But the thing about sound is that once it finds a way in, silence isn't safety. It's just anticipation. It was close to midnight when the phone rang. An actual landline, rotary dial, coil cord plugged into the wall. She hadn't heard it ring in years. It startled her more than it should have, the way it sliced through the stillness of her house. She hesitated before answering, half expecting to hear the soft static she'd come to dread. Instead, what came through was a voice. At first, it was faint, high-pitched, halting, as if coming from far away through layers of air. Then clearer, Hi, Ruthie. The sound froze her blood. It wasn't just familiar, it was identical. That soft rasp at the edges of the words, the uneven rhythm between syllables. It was her, not the voice she had now, heavy with years and smoke, but the one she'd had decades ago. The voice of the little girl who used to talk to herself while building crystal radios in her father's basement. She didn't answer. The line hummed softly. Then the voice giggled. I found your marbles, it said. The blue ones. You lost them under the heater, remember? Mom said the furnace would eat them. Ruth's breath hitched. The marbles. She hadn't thought about them in 50 years. No one alive knew that story. Her mother had died when Ruth was 12. The heater had been replaced decades ago. Yet she could almost see those small glass orbs rolling across the floor, catching the light from a single dangling bulb. She tried to steady her voice. Who is this? The child's voice didn't hesitate. It's me. It's you. The line crackled faintly, an undercurrent of soft static, not random but breathing. The sound wavered like a pulse. I'm in your room, the voice said sweetly. The one with the yellow curtains and the pictures on the wall. The lights are off, but I can still see. Ruth felt a sharp tremor pass through her spine. Her current house had green curtains. She hadn't owned yellow ones since childhood, but her mind conjured the exact room the voice described. The small bedroom on Maple Avenue, the smell of paint and sun-warmed dust, the quiet hum of her first crystal set. How are you? She began, but the voice interrupted. Don't hang up, Ruthie. You'll lose the line. The pitch was wrong now. Still her voice, but deeper somehow, like the tape slowing by imperceptible degrees. She realized her hand was trembling, so hard the receiver clicked against the cradle. I'm just calling to say you left something on. The voice continued, softer now, closer. The lamp by the window. The one you broke when you were 9. You tried to fix it with tape, remember? Ruth looked toward her living room. Her desk lamp was indeed on, though she hadn't touched it all day. She'd forgotten the old tape she once wrapped around its cracked neck. The same fracture, the same tilt. Her throat tightened. What do you want from me? The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was textured, alive, full of the faint hum of distant frequencies, like wind filtered through copper wire. Then, very quietly, the voice said, You're still asleep. Her grip faltered. The receiver grew warm in her hand, almost uncomfortably so. Beneath the hum, she thought she heard other voices now, overlapping whispers, childlike giggles, familiar cadences, all layered under her own. The static thickened, forming a rhythm. Ruthie, said the voice again, but it was older now, her adult voice distorted, fractured by echoes. You shouldn't have listened backward. You shouldn't have tried to measure what remembers. She stumbled back from the wall, pulling the cord taut. The line resisted, vibrating faintly like a living thing. On the other end, the voice began to loop. You left the light on. You left the light on. You left the light on. Ruth slammed the receiver down, but the sound didn't stop. The phone's cradle hummed even after it disconnected, a faint carrier tone bleeding into the room. The air prickled with static. Then, just as she reached for the power strip, the phone rang again. She didn't want to answer, but the curiosity, the compulsion, was stronger. She picked up. This time, there was no voice at first. Only a faint sound, rhythmic, like breathing. Then a whisper very close, perfectly matching her own timbre. You don't remember what came through first, do you? She froze. The laughter wasn't theirs, it said. It was yours. The line dropped. The dial tone never returned. Later, when she replayed her own surveillance equipment out of morbid instinct, she found something she couldn't explain. The recording had captured no voices, no phone ring. Only an 11.11 megahertz carrier wave folded into the background of her own house. And embedded in that signal, buried so deep the analysis software nearly ignored it, was a faint, slowed-down version of her voice saying, We're still in your room. For the rest of that night, Ruth left the lights burning in every room. But when dawn came and she dared to look again, she realized something else had changed. The receiver of her landline, still hanging loose from its cord, was faintly glowing from within, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. And when she pressed her ear to it one last time, there was no sound, just the echo of a child's voice, softly humming the same 3 notes she used to whistle to test her first radio. High, low, high. Then silence that wasn't silence at all, just waiting. The storm began without warning. Not with thunder, not with lightning, but with sound. A low, tremulous hum that rolled across Harper's crossing like something exhaled by the sky itself. It wasn't weather, not in any familiar sense. The air was too still, the clouds too organized, spiraling silently above the town in slow, deliberate circles. By midnight, the power grid began to shudder. Street lamps flickered in unison, casting long, nervous shadows across the wet asphalt. The air felt charged, not cold, not hot, but aware. Residents described their hair standing on end, not from static, but from the uncanny feeling of being watched by the atmosphere. Then came the ash. At first it looked like snow, delicate, silvery flakes drifting down in impossible stillness. But when the particles touched the ground, they didn't melt. They shimmered faintly, each grain pulsing with a soft, bluish glow before fading to gray. Within minutes, entire streets were coated in it, fine as dust, glinting under streetlights like powdered glass. People who stepped outside said it tingled against their skin. Some felt tiny electric pricks. Others described warmth, as if the air itself were gently breathing through them. Scientists later found that each flake carried a measurable charge, weak, harmless, yet persistent. But what no one could explain was how it conducted current even when isolated, as though each fragment retained a memory of energy. By dawn, the storm clouds had dissolved, leaving the town wrapped in eerie silence. The ash-coated rooftops, cars, windows, even the faces of statues in Memorial Park. A fine mist rose where the first sunlight touched it, releasing faint trails of ozone and the scent of burning copper. And then, as the sun crept over the horizon, the televisions came to life. Every set, from new flat screens to forgotten cathode tube relics, sitting unplugged in basements, powered on at once. The displays glowed white, flickered, then stabilized into a black and white image that seemed to come from nowhere. Children, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, their silhouettes faint and translucent, playing in snow that wasn't there. Their shapes flickered like reflections caught in disturbed water, running, laughing, tossing invisible handfuls of powder at one another. They moved with a slow, unnatural grace, like footage filmed underwater. No sound accompanied the image at first, only the faint static hiss of an untuned signal. Then the laughter began. It wasn't loud. It was gentle, muted, like the memory of laughter played through broken speakers. The children on the screens didn't move their mouths, but the sound filled the rooms all the same. Some viewers swore the images were familiar. The houses in the background, the hills, even the distant radio tower. All places from Harper's Crossing, just wrong, tilted, incomplete, as though the world behind the signal was an imitation missing key pieces. When one resident tried to unplug his TV, it stayed on. He cut the main breaker. The screen flickered but didn't die. The silhouettes turned their heads, as if noticing. The laughter stopped. For several seconds, the figures stood motionless, the static deepening into a low, rhythmic pulse, 11 beats, evenly spaced, before the image vanished. Others weren't so lucky. In some homes, the televisions didn't turn off at all. The brightness intensified until it washed the entire room in pale light, illuminating walls, furniture, and faces in perfect black and white contrast. People who touched the screens reported a vibration, a heartbeat rhythm, warm to the touch. When the image finally faded, what remained on the glass was a reflection but residue, faint outlines of small hands pressing the inside, as though the silhouettes had leaned forward before the signal broke. By the next morning, FCC agents returned, this time not to shut down transmitters but to monitor receivers. They found no active broadcast source. Every frequency, AM, FM, digital, was clean. No measurable signal at 11.11 megahertz. Nothing at all. And yet, even without input, the screen still flickered faintly under certain conditions. A static shimmer when the room went completely quiet. Ruth Adler's house was one of the few still under surveillance. When technicians entered, They found her old CRT television glowing despite being unplugged. The ash that had settled on the floor around it vibrated gently, forming subtle rings that expanded outward in sync with a faint hum. The recording they made that morning captured something no one could later replicate. At exactly 2:11 a.m., the snow scene flickered back onto the screen. The children were there again, but this time one of them turned to face the camera. The face was obscured by distortion, but the voice that followed was clear. "Are you awake now?" The sound wasn't carried by the speaker. It came from behind the screen. The technician fled, but the camera kept rolling. The final seconds showed the image folding inward, like light collapsing into itself, leaving behind only a soft field of gray static that shimmered with faint, rhythmic pulses. 11 pulses. Then silence. Outside, the ash began to fall again. But now it was warm to the touch, and when it landed on bare skin, it whispered faintly, as though exhaling a name. No one knew whose. By the next morning, every piece of recorded evidence, every reel, cassette, hard drive, and backup archive tied to the Harper's Crossing broadcasts had begun to rot. Not naturally, not through time or heat or moisture. It was as though something in the air itself had decided to erase memory. At first, the changes were subtle. Evan's old station tapes, once pristine, developed faint distortions. Soft bends in tone, voices warping mid-sentence, laughter bleeding through songs that had never contained it. The engineers assumed humidity, oxidation, mechanical decay. But when they opened the cases, the reels were warm to the touch, pulsing with faint static like living muscle. Then the true degradation began. Overnight, entire shells of magnetic tape went blank. The ferrite strips inside each cassette lost their magnetization simultaneously, leaving behind nothing but smooth, dark shimmer that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. Computers that attempted to read digital archives displayed the same error. Data loop detected. Recursive pattern interrupt. The next morning, someone noticed something even stranger. The erasure wasn't complete. Deep within the signal residue, the faint electromagnetic ghost that remained even after full wipe, there was a word, not spoken, but etched into the very noise floor of the medium itself. Remember. No voice, no inflection. Just a perfectly measured waveform that spelled it out in rhythmic intervals, as though the medium had learned to speak its own dying breath. Archivists played back the surviving fragments on every available device. Old recorders, digital converters, oscilloscopes. It didn't matter. Each machine produced the same result. A low, soft whisper that emerged after 33 seconds of silence, repeating once every 11 beats. Remember, remember, remember. When slowed, the frequency pattern aligned exactly with the harmonic clusters Ruth Adler had mapped before her disappearance. Each repetition fluctuated subtly, the wave folding on itself like an echo from an impossible depth. To some, it sounded mournful. To others, it sounded like instruction. The engineers from the FCC task force attempted to isolate the signal source, but the word existed within the tapes, not on them. A kind of residual magnetism too precise to be random. When they tried recording new audio over the erased reels, the equipment malfunctioned. The record heads overheated, the playback meters jammed at exactly 11.11 megahertz, and every attempt produced the same outcome. The fresh audio dissolved into static within hours, leaving behind only that same single word. Remember. And yet, no one could agree on how it sounded. Each person who listened described it differently. To some, the voice was childlike, to others weary, distorted, ancient. One technician swore it was his own voice reversed. Another said it was her mother's, repeating the word in the rhythm she used to wake her for school. Soon, even the untouched materials began to react. Hard drives that had never been connected to any playback system emitted faint electromagnetic pulses. The pulse pattern matched a heartbeat, 72 beats per minute, and between each pulse came a brief, whispered distortion, as though something were breathing inside the data. The archivists grew paranoid. Some refused to enter the evidence room at all, claiming the sound continued even when the power was cut. Others said the word had begun leaking into their dreams. A journalist from the Fairview Chronicle managed to record a late-night interview with one of the engineers before he disappeared. In the audio, His voice trembles as he describes a moment he realized the phenomenon wasn't limited to tapes. "I wiped everything, even burned the drives. But when I woke up, the word was on my walls. Not written, printed in light. I could hear it when I blinked, like the air was speaking through the metal. It didn't want the recordings erased. It wanted us erased and the word left behind. That recording, too, degraded overnight. By dawn, all that remained was a soft static field, rhythmically pulsing 11 times before fading out completely. No living witness ever reported hearing Remember out loud again, but radios began muttering it under breath when the town fell silent, especially around 2:11 a.m. The sound wasn't broadcast. It simply appeared. And when the townspeople stopped keeping tapes, when they stopped recording anything at all, the silence didn't return. It thickened, magnetic, aware, patient. Some said that was a lesson. The ghosts in the frequency didn't want to be remembered. They wanted to remember us. The occupation began quietly, the way disasters often do when bureaucracy wants to keep them small. The U.S. Air Force called it Operation Signal Containment, though the memo handed to town officials used softer words: electronic stabilization, public safety protocol, temporary relocation. Within 48 hours, Harper's crossing was sealed. Convoys rolled in from the east, their insignias covered in matte tape, their headlights dimmed even at noon. Soldiers went door to door, handing out relocation papers printed on the same cheap gray stock used for evacuation notices during floods. But this wasn't weather. This was silence wearing a uniform. Residents were told the town's infrastructure had become electromagnetically unstable. They would be moved to temporary housing 10 miles west while technicians conducted atmospheric calibration. Most didn't argue. By then the nights had grown unbearable. Radios whispered without power. Phones rang without numbers. From the hills above, Harper's Crossing looked like a quarantine of ghosts. Antennas torn down, dishes removed from rooftops, power lines sagging like veins drained of current. The Air Force erected perimeter fences around the old transmission field, the place where the tower once stood. Heavy equipment arrived, ground-penetrating radars, mobile labs, listening trucks. No one outside the fence was allowed to carry metal objects or recording devices. But the signal didn't fade. It deepened. Even after the last family was bussed out, instruments inside the perimeter began detecting low-frequency resonance, vibrations rising not from the air but from below. The hum at 11.11 megahertz now carried undertones that no longer mapped the radio at all. It propagated through the soil, through pipes, through the concrete foundations of abandoned houses. When the engineers drilled the first test bore near the former tower site, their seismographs lit up with harmonic interference. The readings pulsed like a heartbeat, spreading outward in concentric waves that traveled faster than sound. Some technicians reported hearing voices echoing to the drilling rigs, faint, metallic murmurs that seemed to use the vibration itself as language. At night, motion sensors in the empty streets triggered without wind. Cameras recorded no figures, only distortions. Faint outlines of the dust that resembled small shapes running, playing, scattering like shadows under snow. The containment teams responded by grounding the entire power grid. They cut every line, drained every transformer, dismantled every remaining antenna. Still, the signal persisted. It no longer needed airwaves. It had found another medium. Geophones planted along the riverbed detected rhythmic modulations coming from 40 meters underground. The frequency matched the degraded recordings recovered from the tapes. The same intervals, the same pattern of 11 beats followed by silence. When the data was converted into audio, the waveform spelled a single, familiar word in harmonic translation. Remember. The scientists listening in the control van said they could feel it more than hear it, a tremor that resonated in bone, in molars, in the cavities behind their eyes. One technician vomited. Another whispered that the ground felt alive, that it was breathing through them. By the third week, the containment perimeter had expanded to the entire valley. The Air Force built steel shielding into the soil, grounding rods sunk deep into bedrock, each tipped with copper crosses meant to neutralize residual current. Yet every morning the instruments reported the same impossible reading. the signal strength increasing by precisely 0.11% per hour, as if feeding on its own observation. Rumors spread among the soldiers. Some said they could hear laughter echoing through the drain pipes at night. Others claimed the hum shaped words, if you press your ear to the ground. A few deserted, leaving their boots behind, soles blackened with a fine dust that sparked faintly in the dark. Then came the incident at the field lab. The underground sensors began transmitting on their own. No uplink, no external power. Monitors filled with scrolling text composed of single repeated lines. We are still here. We are underneath. Moments later, every device in the command tent shut off simultaneously. The silence that followed was so complete that men swore they could hear their own heartbeats sinking to the pulse coming from below. The next morning, the perimeter lights flickered back on, running on generators that had been drained dry. The hum returned, louder now, steady, omnipresent. The ash that had once fallen from the sky began seeping from cracks in the earth, glowing faintly, vibrating to the rhythm of 11.11 megahertz. Harper's crossing no longer transmitted. It resonated, and those who stood too long near the ground swore they could feel something beneath their boots, a slow, deliberate movement, like children shifting in their sleep, whispering to the soil in voices made of static. Stay awake. By the 4th week of the occupation, Harper's Crossing no longer resembled a town. It was a skeleton of streets and hollowed houses, a quiet geometry of absence. The power lines were gone, the lights dismantled, the windows covered in reflective film to block whatever frequencies still lingered in the air. And yet at night, survivors, those who had hidden in basements rather than evacuate, reported that the silence itself had begun to sing. They called it the underground choir. It began as a vibration, faint but rhythmic, passing through copper pipes and heating vents like the pulse of distant machinery. But soon the vibration found shape, tones, pitches, harmonics aligning into the unmistakable cadence of human voices. The sound was soft, almost tender, children humming what at first seemed like lullabies. But the melodies never resolved. The notes curved backward, as though the songs were being sung in reverse, unwinding sleep instead of inviting it. In the basements, the air trembled, metal shelves rattled, water in old glass jars formed concentric ripples that moved counter to gravity. One woman swore her baby monitor flickered on by itself, displaying no image, only the low melodic hum that rose and fell in time with her own heartbeat. The child in her arms slept soundly, but every time she tried to hum the song, her voice matched the rhythm of the sound without meaning to. The survivors soon realized the voices weren't just echoing through the pipes. They were using them. The plumbing, the ventilation, the gas lines. Every hollow conduit in town had become a choir throat, carrying the sound from one home to another until the entire understructure of Harper's Crossing was vibrating like a single instrument. They tried to block it out. Towels stuffed in vents, water running in sinks, faucets sealed with wax. Nothing worked. The hum slipped through everything solid, using the foundation like a drum. It grew loudest around 2:11 a.m., when the temperature dropped just enough for condensation to form on the metal. Then the air would tremble and the lullaby would begin anew, always the same melody, always reversed, always slightly closer. Those who dared to record the sound found that no device could capture it properly. Microphones picked up only static punctuated by rhythmic gaps, 11 pulses, then silence. When played backward, the waveform produced faint syllables that, to trained ears, resembled language. Linguists later confirmed that each repetition translated to the same simple sentence. We remember who sang first. The humming didn't stop with the voices. The survivors began to feel inside their bodies. Tooth fillings buzzed. Heartbeats synced unconsciously to the rhythm. One man, hiding in a fallout shelter beneath the old school, reported seeing dust swirl in patterns matching sound waves, spelling words across the floorboards before collapsing into nothing. At times, the lullabies carried fragments of old radio jingles or nursery rhymes the townspeople had known as children, songs broadcast decades ago by WRX, Evan Harlow's station. The voices blended those melodies with new ones, building harmonies too complex for human lungs. It wasn't music anymore. It was architecture, rebuilding itself inside the resonance of human memory. The survivors grew pale, sleepless. They stopped speaking above whispers, afraid of being heard by whatever listened from beneath. Some said the voices weren't trying to frighten them, that they were trying to teach them the words. One night, a woman hiding beneath the butcher's shop reported hearing her own name sung gently through the vent. When she pressed her ear to the wall, she heard the voice of her daughter, dead 5 years, humming the reverse lullaby and laughing softly between verses. The next morning, the woman was gone. Those who remained claimed they heard her voice added to the choir that night. The harmony had grown fuller, more intricate, like the sound of many small lungs breathing in perfect rhythm. By the end of that week, the humming could be heard even above ground. Standing in the empty streets, one could feel more than hear it. A vibration in the soles of the feet, in the fillings of teeth, in the thin metal frames of abandoned cars. The entire town seemed to breathe in time, the hum moving through soil, air, and flesh alike. At precisely 2:11 every night, the voices aligned into a single note that resonated long enough to make the earth itself tremble. And those who still listened swore they could hear, buried deep beneath the reverse melody, a faint human whisper carried to the hum, gentle as a secret shared through static. "Stay awake, and we will sing you back." 2 weeks after blackout, just before dawn, a highway patrolman spotted a small figure walking barefoot along Route 7, the old road leading away from Harper's crossing. The boy was covered in gray dust, his skin pale and his hair matted with ash that shimmered faintly under the patrol car's headlights. He walked slowly, mechanically, his gaze fixed forward as though following something only he could see. When the officer stepped out and called to him, the boy stopped but didn't turn. His lips moved, but no sound came at first. Then, in a flat, toneless voice, he began reciting a sequence of numbers and letters. WRX 11.11, Channel 11, standby over. The same call signs that had once belonged to Evan Harlow's vanished station. It was Lucas Martin, the child who had disappeared months earlier near the old transmission tower, now stood alive, expressionless, his bare feet bleeding against the cold asphalt. His pupils were almost colorless, washed in the same milky hue that light took when filtered through storm clouds. When the officer tried to touch him, a faint static shock jumped between them, enough to make the man's radio hiss with interference. They took Lucas to St. Andrew's Medical Center in Fairview. Every monitor in the ward began malfunctioning the moment he arrived. Heart rate sensors froze, thermometers flickered, and the power grid surged twice before stabilizing. The attending physician, Dr. Keller, noted that the boy's pulse wasn't irregular. It was perfectly regular, pulsing at an exact rate of 11.11 hertz. Each beat was identical, unwavering, as if synced to an external metronome. Even stranger, when the hospital's biomonitors translated his heart rhythm into an audio waveform, it produced a faint signal in the radio band, 11.11 megahertz, the same phantom frequency that had swallowed the town. Lucas didn't speak, except in bursts of broken jargon. When asked his name, he answered with coordinates. When asked where he had been, he said, "Under the signal." Then, in the same monotone, "It's warm there." He showed no signs of dehydration or malnutrition. His body temperature was slightly below normal. His skin carried a mild electric potential measurable with a voltmeter. The readings fluctuated in sync with a background hum that no one else in the room could hear. When the nurses tried to sedate him, the lights dimmed and the air filled with a faint scent of ozone. That night, the hospital security cameras recorded something impossible. At exactly 2:11 a.m., all screens in the monitoring room flickered white. In that instant, Lucas sat upright in his bed and began speaking into the air, his voice echoing as if picked up by an unseen transmitter. WRX relay, standby channel 11. Children confirmed, remember, remember. The power failed for 11 seconds. When the emergency lights came on, Lucas was still sitting upright, his eyes glowing faintly with the same pale luminescence that once shimmered through the ash. His heartbeat remained steady at 11.11 hertz. Doctors later discovered that the electromagnetic interference during those 11 seconds wasn't confined to the hospital. Every functioning receiver within 100 miles, radios, televisions, even wireless routers, logged a brief, identical signal burst at 11.11 megahertz. Embedded in the carrier wave was a single audio file. When decrypted, It contained Lucas's voice repeating one phrase over and over. "We're not done remembering." After that night, he stopped speaking entirely. But when doctors attached an EEG to measure brain activity, the readings formed patterns that weren't random, harmonic clusters that matched the modulation curves of speech frequencies. The waveform spelled a single word, when visualized spectrally: home. By the end of the week, the boy's pulse began to slow, but the frequency remained constant, unwavering, pure resonant. The hum it produced could be felt through the walls of the hospital, spreading through power conduits, water lines, and vents. And in homes across Fairview, radios that had been silent since the blackout whispered to life once more, their dials frozen between stations, repeating the same calm, childlike voice that had once filled the airwaves of Harper's Crossing. Channel 11, all calls acknowledge, we found our signal, we're still awake. After that, the boy's body cooled. His heartbeat stopped. But the monitors continued to pulse, 11 times, perfectly timed, before fading to static. The doctors tried to shut down the machines. They couldn't. The power cords had already been unplugged. Ruth's maps looked like fever dreams of electricity, concentric rings of dots, lines of red ink, and coordinates pinned with trembling precision. For weeks she had been tracking the anomalies secretly, triangulating every pulse, every tremor, every inexplicable interference pattern that flickered to the ground beneath Harper's Crossing. She didn't trust the military data. The Air Force technician spoke of subsurface resonance, but their instruments went dark whenever she came near the perimeter. So she built her own system, hand-wire receivers scavenged from abandoned equipment, powered by scavenged batteries, and copper wire strung through a basement window. She plotted every reading by hand on an old survey map from the county archives. At first, the points seemed random, just dots marking interference spikes that surfaced and vanished without pattern. But one night, at exactly 2:11 a.m., her receivers began to hum in perfect synchrony. 11 pulses, then silence. She marked them all, transferring the coordinates to the map, and when she stepped back, the pattern emerged. A spiral. It began at the outskirts of town and curved inward with geometric precision, each arc equidistant, each loop smaller than the last, coiling toward a single point like a fingerprint burned into the earth. The center lay directly beneath the site of the old WKRX transmission tower. The same field now sealed by fences, guard, and floodlights, the ground where the laughter had first been heard. She checked her math, checked again. The curve was too perfect to be random. When she overlaid magnetic data from before the blackout, the same pattern appeared, faint but present, as if the spiral had been forming for months, maybe years, beneath their feet. Ruth drove to the edge of the restricted zone that night. The guards were gone. The military had pulled out days earlier, without explanation, leaving behind warning signs that fluttered in the wind. The field was silent, except for the faint hum that rose from the soil, not from the air, but through it, as if the ground were exhaling sound. She stood at the fence, holding her receiver. The dials spun without input, aligning themselves to one frequency, 11.11 megahertz. The needle stabilized. The speaker emitted a pulse, 11 beats, then a pause, then the faint sound of children humming. Not laughter this time. Not play. Something slower. A song turning inward, like memory remembering itself. Ruth stepped closer to the fence and whispered, "I hear you." The ground vibrated. The spiral on her map shifted minutely, one new point appearing, right where she stood. The pattern wasn't finished. It was still growing. Each new anomaly folded into curve, feeding the spiral inward like a coil tightening around a single breath. Her receiver buzzed. A faint voice, layered with static, whispered through the speaker, her own voice younger, clearer. "Keep drawing." When she returned home, she spread out the updated map across her kitchen table. The spiral had reached its final turn. The center was no longer buried beneath the tower site. It had moved deeper, below it, converging at coordinates that didn't match any known geological feature. She highlighted the central point, pressed her finger against the paper. The wood beneath her fingertips was warm. The map began to hum. The radio on the counter, long since unplugged, flickered to life. The same pulse repeated. 11 times, perfect, unwavering, followed by a whisper that filled the room. soft and distant, like a lullaby sung through miles of wire. We drew you too. The lights dimmed. The walls vibrated gently. Somewhere far beneath Harper's Crossing, the spiral continued to turn. It happened exactly 1 year to the minute after the first signal. 2:11 a.m., the hour when the world seemed to remember itself. For months, Harper's Crossing had been nothing but an empty scar on the map, a fenced wasteland where the Air Force had stripped the soil bare, a place that flickered on satellite imagery like a smudge of interference. But that night, the perimeter lights flickered back on, not the white flood lamps of the military, but the original beacons of the WKRX tower, the red warning lights that hadn't burned in years. Except there was no tower anymore. From the highway miles away, truck drivers saw it first. A column of dim light rising from the earth where the structure had once stood, shimmering like heat mirage. At its peak, thin filaments of static twisted together, glowing with the same red rhythm as the old obstruction lights. The pulse rate, 11 beats, pause, 11 beats, matched the modulation pattern that had haunted every transmission since the beginning. By 2:15, the phenomenon was visible for 30 miles in every direction. The sky over Harper's Crossing rippled like fabric in windless air. Long tendrils of ionized plasma formed arcs between unseen points, sketching outlines in the clouds, shifting shapes that flickered between coherence and chaos. At first, observers thought they were looking at Aurora or St. Elmo's fire. But when the static burst synchronized, the shapes stabilized. They were faces, dozens of them, formed from ionized air and the faint geometry of electromagnetic discharge. Children's faces, open, half-smiling, eyes wide and luminous. Each visage glowed for a few seconds before fading into mist, replaced by another and another, as if the sky were scrolling to the memory of those who had vanished. They looked down at the ruins, their features built from living light, from the same radioplasma that had once carried their laughter through the frequencies of the town. Pilots over the region reported instruments malfunctioning. Radar screens filled with interference shaped like a spiral, rotating slowly counterclockwise around the epicenter. Every full revolution emitted a brief pulse at 11.11 megahertz, strong enough to drown out military channels for precisely 11 seconds. The transmissions contained no words, only modulated bursts of static that, when visualized spectrally, formed perfect childlike handwriting spelling a single phrase. We remember. On the ground, the air hummed so low it vibrated in bone. Those who had stayed behind, the hidden few who'd refused to leave Harper's Crossing, described hearing voices not from the sky, but from within themselves. Echoes of long-forgotten songs, humming reversed lullabies, the rhythm of a heartbeat that wasn't theirs. Ruth Adler, standing at the edge of the abandoned field with her receiver pressed against her chest, watched as the glowing filaments spiraled downward, weaving in and out of one another like veins of light. The sky didn't illuminate the earth. It reflected it. The faces weren't looking down. They were looking out, as though the heavens themselves were now a transmitter and humanity had become the receiver. For several minutes, everything, the hum, the wind, even the clouds, aligned into a single resonant tone. The color of the plasma shifted from red to soft gold, and in that moment, the ruined field seemed to breathe. Then, just as suddenly, the light collapsed inward. Every radio in a 100-mile radius powered on for 11 seconds. No signal, no speech, just a soft, steady sound of children laughing. When it ended, the sky was clear. The stars returned. The tower was still gone. But those who had recorded the event discovered something impossible. The final burst of plasma had etched an image into the ionosphere, a faint electromagnetic scar, visible only to radar. It was the same spiral Ruth had mapped, frozen above the earth like a fingerprint left by something vast and patient. And on every recording, at the very end, as the laughter faded, a new voice whispered beneath the static. Not pleading, not threatening, just gentle, almost relieved. Transmission complete. No one was supposed to go inside the tower ruins again. The area had been declared inert, the ground sealed with concrete, and the field surrounded by new fencing that stretched for half a mile in every direction. But the static still bled through, a faint, invisible pressure in the air that microphones could sense even when a human ear could not. It began when the autonomous monitors reactivated themselves. The military had left behind buried audio sensors meant to measure soil resonance, forgotten relics of Operation Signal Containment. At 2:11 a.m., one of them came back online, not through power stored, but through an internal charge induced by something underneath. The microphones started recording. What they captured wasn't noise. The frequencies registered far below human hearing, between 5 and 8 hertz, the range of brain waves, heartbeats, earthquakes. When the recordings were later amplified, the waveforms revealed patterns that weren't geological. They were deliberate, cyclical, too organized to be random vibration. The signal throbbed in rhythmic bursts, like a heart beating through stone. Then, under the subsonic pulse, faint higher harmonics began to appear. Fragments of speech stretched and folded until they barely resembled language. Audio engineers slowed the playback by a factor of 100. What emerged from the noise chilled them. Breath. Actual inhalations and exhalations. Too slow to belong to a living human being, echoing through metallic space. And then, soft as wind through a tunnel, came a whisper. One. Static followed. A long, trembling sigh in the wires. Then again. Two. Another pause, almost like waiting. The microphone's gain spiked, as if the very air leaned closer to speak. 3. And finally, barely audible beneath the hum. Home. The syllable stretched into a low resonance that shook the foundation sensors. The tone decayed, then repeated, looping at 11-second intervals. Each cycle began with a new pulse, perfectly synchronized with a modulation pattern of 11.11 megahertz. The sound wasn't coming from above ground. It originated nearly 40 meters below the sealed foundation, beneath layers of concrete and compacted soil. Ground-penetrating radar showed faint fluctuations there, but no cavity, no void, no equipment. Just solid earth. And yet, when the sensors were repositioned, the heartbeat signal moved with them, as though tracking whoever listened. When the waveform was translated into visual spectrograms, the patterns formed a spiral identical to Ruth Adler's maps, each curve aligning precisely with coordinates of past interference spikes. At the center of that spiral, written in low-frequency harmonics, invisible to normal instruments, appeared one more phrase. We are counting with you. The sound grew stronger every night. Microphones again picking up overlapping voices. Not just one child, but many, all whispering numbers in perfect synchrony, their rhythm tightening towards something inevitable. The heartbeats between each count grew faster, the pauses shorter, as though whatever was beneath the ground was approaching the end of the sequence. By the third night, the count had reached 10, and at 2:11 a.m. sharp, the whisper returned, soft, unified, resonant, an entire unseen choir murmuring together. 11! The earth beneath the tower exhaled. Every sensor within the containment field registered a massive electromagnetic spike. Not destructive, but rhythmic, like the thump of something enormous turning over in its sleep. The lights of the monitoring equipment dimmed, then flared. The subsonic hum became music. The same backward lullaby that had haunted the basements, now rising to the ground in harmonic waves. And beneath it all, woven into the heartbeat and breath, came a final phrase, clear and steady, as if spoken directly into the microphones from somewhere far deeper than soil or stone. We remember the way home. The night Evan collapsed on air, the broadcast was already strange from the beginning. Listeners reported that his voice, normally calm and measured, carried a faint echo, as if he were speaking from inside a metal chamber instead of the studio. The intro music to Night Transit came through distorted, slowed slightly, warping into minor keys that no one recognized. Still, the red on air light glowed, and Evan's voice, trembling but steady, filled the airwaves one last time. It's been 1 year since the first signal, he said softly. You can probably feel it tonight. The air's thicker, isn't it? Like sound itself is holding its breath. He paused. Behind him, listeners could hear a low hum that wasn't part of the usual static. Technicians at the transmitter later confirmed that no such sound existed on their end. They said it was over, Evan continued. They said the ground was sealed, that the towers were gone, that the frequency had nowhere left to live. But they were wrong. The hum never left. It just went underground. His words were calm, almost attached, but there was something beneath them, a quiet dread, like someone describing their own funeral in real time. You might hear it too, he said, in your walls, in the wiring, in the blood behind your ears. It's quieter than silence now, but it's there. They've learned to wait between the seconds. At that exact moment, several radio stations along the eastern seaboard reported a burst of interference. The signal cut across every AM band for 11 seconds, broadcasting only a single sound: children humming the reverse lullaby. The modulation matched exactly the 11.11 megahertz pattern from the original Harper's crossing transmissions. Back in the WKRX booth, the engineer on duty saw Evan remove his headphones and press his fingers to his temple. He whispered something, too soft for the microphone to catch, then leaned closer to the console. You wanted to know what they are, he said, but that's not the right question. You should ask where they are, because... He stopped. The lights flickered. The meters on the control board spiked into red, freezing there as the hum deepened into a resonant tone that rattled the glass. Evan's voice broke into static. Because they're not coming through, he said, the words cracked, breathless, distant, as if someone else were finishing his thought. The studio camera recorded his last seconds. Evan stared past the microphone, eyes unfocused, a small trickle of blood seeping from one nostril. They're not coming through, he repeated. Then, after a long, shaking breath, they're coming back. The feed cut instantly. Listeners described a silence that followed as physically painful. Not the absence of sound, but an inversion of it. Some radios emitted a low-frequency pulse that could be felt more than heard, shaking dishes and picture frames. In homes across the region, televisions powered on by themselves, showing a gray field of static that seemed to move in shallow waves, like breath beneath a sheet. When technicians broke into the booth minutes later, they found Evan collapsed across the console. His body was warm, but his pulse was irregular, 11 beats per second, perfectly synced with the 11.11 megahertz frequency still humming faintly through the speakers. Every analog meter in the room spun simultaneously. The broadcast equipment, long outdated, disconnected from the main transmitter, had reactivated on its own. The system log showed an outgoing transmission, but not to any known frequency. Instead, the data pointed inward, a loopback signal broadcasting directly into the booth, as though the air itself were a receiver. The tape of the final minutes degraded overnight, like all the others before it. But one fragment survived, a faint echo of Evan's voice, repeated backwards under the static, stretched thin and quiet as breath. We were the signal all along. After that, WKRX's frequency fell silent. No station claimed its band. No transmitter acknowledged its existence. But at 2:11 a.m. every night since, receivers across abandoned counties still flicker briefly to life. No sound, no music, just a single heartbeat pulsing 11 times, followed by the soft, unmistakable whisper of man saying, through impossible distance, "They're home." Recordings from that night have become the most studied and most feared 6 minutes in the history of human broadcasting. Every tower, every satellite, every transceiver across the globe captured it, though none could agree on where it began. Later, scientists would call it the echo event. To those who lived through it, it was something simpler, more visceral. The night the world itself laughed. It began 22 seconds after Evan Harlow's final words, the instant his transmission cut out. The monitors in the WKRX control room went dark. The air thickened with low electrical vibration. And then, as though every device on Earth inhaled together, the entire electromagnetic spectrum began to flicker. Radio engineers in Tokyo first noticed it. A ripple in the static floor across every frequency, from ELF to microwave. Then came the reports from Chile, Norway, South Africa, the Pacific Research Array. Within 30 seconds, all bands, AM, FM, shortwave, cellular, satellite, synchronized into a single pulse. The waveform repeated 11 times, then paused, then repeated again. Its modulation curve was unlike anything ever recorded. When the first analysis came through, no one believed it. The waveform, when slowed and converted into audible sound, didn't resemble static or coded communication. It resembled laughter. Not human laughter exactly, but something close, tonal, melodic, with harmonic layers stacked like the echo of 1,000 children laughing underwater. Each cycle began as a low rumble, rose to a bright peak, then fell away with the same rhythm as human breath between fits of joy. The sound was everywhere, not heard, but felt. For 6 full minutes, the earth sang. In observatories and control rooms, needles jumped, oscilloscopes bloomed into intricate fractal spirals, and the auroras over both poles brightened tenfold, casting eerie ribbons of color deep into the stratosphere. The pulse moved through the ionosphere like a living wave, igniting charged particles into shapes that flickered, for just an instant like outlines of small hands reaching upward. On the ground, the effects were stranger still. Compasses spun. Power grids hummed in harmonic resonance. In cities, the hum found every conductive surface, rail lines, skyscraper girders, bridges, and made them sing. Some residents said the metal itself laughed. Animals froze or fled. Birds circled in perfect spirals before vanishing into cloud cover. Seismographs across multiple continents registered faint rhythmic vibrations, too shallow to be earthquakes, but too uniform to dismiss as noise. The entire crust of the planet had begun to resonate at 11.11 megahertz, translated down into subsonic frequency, a whisper through stone. In hospitals, heart monitors began to sync. Patients in comas opened their eyes, not fully conscious but tracking something unseen. Neonates in maternity wards began breathing in unison, their tiny chests rising and falling in time with the electromagnetic pulse. Every 11 seconds, all medical equipment paused, lights dimming, then returning with a faint scent of ozone. On aircraft mid-flight, pilots reported strange harmonics in the engines, a sympathetic frequency that caused control panels to tremble. At 2:12 Universal Time Coordinated, NORAD satellites briefly went offline. For one impossible frame, their imaging sensors captured a thin band of light encircling the planet's upper atmosphere, a halo of faint plasma, pulsing at the same rhythm as the laughter waveform. In deep-sea research stations, sonar arrays echoed with strange feedback. Phantom signals rising from the ocean floor, identical in structure to the broadcast pulses. One recording from a Mariana sensor grid captured the pulse reflecting off the basin walls, forming perfect geometric resonance, a spiral identical to the one Ruth Adler had mapped months earlier. At exactly 3 minutes into the event, something impossible happened. Every functioning clock, digital or analog, stalled for 11 seconds. Not broke, not lost time, but stalled. The second hands froze mid-tick. The quartz crystals inside watches stopped vibrating. Atomic clocks ceased oscillation. Then, simultaneously, all resumed, as though time itself had blinked. Satellite telemetry later confirmed it. For those 11 seconds, the Earth's magnetic field fluctuated not randomly, but rhythmically. The dipole lines twisted inward, coiling around the equator like threads around a spindle. At the poles, plasma storms erupted, not lightning, but luminous spirals visible from orbit, glowing the shapes of rings, as though the planet were echoing the laughter back into space. And in that same window, a new pattern appeared in the ionospheric data, a signature nearly identical to a human EEG, the electrical rhythm of a dreaming brain. Scientists compared it to the delta wave patterns of a sleeping child. The Earth, it seemed, was dreaming. In cities, people began to weep without understanding why. The sound inside their skulls, too low for the ear, too deep for the body, felt like memory awakening. Radios came alive on every channel, whispering the same syllables beneath the laughter. 1, 2, 3, home. Some believed it was a return of the lost, the children, the voices that had haunted the frequencies for a year. Others thought it was imitation, a mimicry of humanity by something vast and newly self-aware. Whatever it was, it recognized rhythm. It recognized counting. At 2:16 Universal Time Coordinated, the laughter deepened. The harmonic layers expanded, building into chords impossible for human throats. 11 distinct tones resonating as one. The waveform now stretched across the full electromagnetic spectrum, from radio to gamma, binding everything with invisible symmetry. In orbit, communication satellites captured the final phase, a pulse shaped like a heartbeat, radiating outward from a single epicenter, Harper's Crossing. For 6 minutes, the world pulsed as one organism. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Silence, not just absence of sound, but an absence of interference, of static, of movement in the ionosphere. The kind of silence that makes the body question whether it's still alive. Instruments flatlined. Power returned. Birds fell still in midair and resumed flight. But something was different. When the event ended, every recording device, from government satellites to amateur ham radios, contained residual electromagnetic noise imprinted in the data. Faint, spectral images of children's faces, blurred by motion, as if captured mid-laughter. Each face unique, some familiar, others not human at all. The last 6 seconds of the event were the most unsettling. The laughter slowed, the tones descending in pitch until they became a low rumble indistinguishable from thunder. Then a voice, faint and layered, whispered beneath it. Dozens of voices harmonized into one. "You called us home." The phrase repeated twice, once in reverse, then forward again, overlapping into itself until words became the shape of a heartbeat. In the days that followed, researchers across every major observatory struggled to explain it. The pulse left behind no radioactive residue, no damage to infrastructure, yet the global magnetic field remained subtly altered, rotating a fraction slower, its alignment shifted by 11 arcseconds. Every attempt to replicate the signal failed. Artificial transmissions of identical waveform structures produced only static. But when scientists tried playing the original recordings through loudspeakers, equipment began to malfunction. Metal surfaces vibrated in sync, paper floated, dust gathered into spiral shapes. And beneath all of it, microphones picked up faint whispers buried deep in subsonic range, counting softly, endlessly. 1, 2, 3, then silence. Across the world, reports came in as strange electromagnetic echoes, signals rebounding from nowhere, appearing at exactly 11.11 megahertz for 11 seconds each night. They carried no content, only faint, rhythmic patterns that matched human heartbeats and distant laughter. The sound varied slightly depending on location, as though the planet itself were transmitting through its own magnetic veins. In a bunker deep beneath what had once been Harper's Crossing, a surviving recorder, one of Ruth Adler's analog models, captured something no digital device could. When played back, the recording contained the hum of the pulse not as data, but as music, faint, broken, but melodic. The same lullaby the children had once sung backward through the pipes, slowed to human tempo. The melody unfolded into something almost tender, a pattern repeating in cycles of 11 notes. A child's voice whispered beneath it, fragile but certain, "We learned your names." Then the sound of breathing, not one breath, but millions, layered into one sustained exhale that faded into silence. For days afterward, the world's magnetic field hummed audibly in the recordings, a residual resonance impossible to measure but impossible to deny. Sensitive microphones continued to pick up faint traces of low-frequency oscillation, shaped like laughter fading into memory. The planet's ionosphere glowed slightly brighter at night, a shimmer visible only under specific instruments, but those who saw it swore the light flickered in spirals, converging above the coordinates of the old tower site. And then came the reports of a new kind of interference, whispers through silence. People began hearing faint voices in white noise, not in radios, but in the spaces between sound. Quiet rooms carried soft echoes of words that weren't there. Remember, stay awake, home. No one could trace it. No one could measure it. Yet every time researchers plotted the occurrences, from static bursts and power lines to seismic oscillations, they aligned perfectly with the same spiral Ruth had discovered, now global, expanding outward from Harper's Crossing like the fingerprint of a waking dream. Months later, a spectral analysis of the global recordings revealed one final anomaly. When all data from the 6-minute event was overlaid and slowed by a factor of a million, the waveform formed a perfect spiral, 11 concentric rings converging toward a single mathematical point. In the very center of that spiral, buried deep in the noise, was a pattern indistinguishable from a child's heartbeat. It beat 11 times, then stopped. For a moment too brief to measure, every compass needle on Earth quivered. The global positioning network glitched by exactly 11 meters. Clocks across every time zone flickered forward by 11 seconds. And from every speaker, every microphone, every device capable of vibration, there came, just once, a small, unmistakable sound. A single, soft laugh. It lasted less than a heartbeat, yet the instruments registered it everywhere at once, from the deepest ocean trenches to thin edges of the upper atmosphere. And then it was gone. But those who listen closely to the final frame of the recordings, buried beneath the static, swear they can still hear a voice, quiet content, fading into the cosmic noise like the last note of a lullaby meant for the world itself. Good night. When Harper's crossing was finally evacuated, it didn't feel like an ending, more like the slow fading of a signal that refused to die. The Air Force declared the town electromagnetically unstable and issued the evacuation under the same bland language they had used for years: precautionary containment, public safety relocation. But the truth was simpler. The hum had become unbearable. Even after the tower's demolition, the ground still whispered. Radios crackled in empty houses. Televisions flickered without power, and the air inside basements vibrated like a living thing. The children's lullaby, reversed, fractured, unending, played faintly in the pipes of abandoned kitchens. Families packed what they could and left in convoys before dawn. The soldiers who escorted them wore protective ear coverings and avoided eye contact. Ruth Adler, now older and haunted by her own maps, was among the last to leave. Before stepping into the evacuation van, she looked back toward the empty field where the broadcast tower had once stood and thought, "It's still speaking." No one ever returned. Over time, Harper's Crossing vanished from maps. The perimeter fences rusted. The roads leading in were reclassified as private property. The field went fallow, wheat thistle, and pale weeds swallowing driveways and sidewalks. The hum dulled into something too low to notice. And yet it never stopped. Decades passed. Technology changed. The story became legend. The haunted radio town, the place where frequencies went to die. Ghost hunters, amateur physicists, and documentary crews occasionally trespassed into the overgrown ruins, but none stayed long. Their recordings all ended the same way: bursts of static, then silence. It wasn't until 37 years later, during an aerial thermal survey for an unrelated weather mapping project, that the spiral was seen. At first, the analysts thought it was equipment error, a faint spiral pattern glowing in the infrared bands, stretching across miles of farmland surrounding the abandoned town. But when the data was layered across multiple passes, the pattern remained identical. It wasn't random vegetation or irrigation marks. It was burned into the soil itself. The spiral's geometry matched the harmonic structure of 11.11 megahertz exactly, each curve representing a modulation frequency, each loop an interval of 11 seconds. It radiated outward from the exact coordinates where the original broadcast tower once stood. Scientists dispatched to investigate found no visible marks on the ground. To the naked eye, the fields were ordinary, but under infrared, the spiral shimmered faintly, like heat bleeding through cold stone. Soil samples revealed microscopic particles of fused silica, glass formed by intense bursts of energy, the kind that usually require lightning strikes. And yet, there had been no lightning there in decades. When the data was run through magnetic resonance imaging, faint residual current patterns emerged, still pulsing, though imperceptibly weak. The rhythm was consistent. 11 beats, pause, 11 beats. It was as if the earth itself still remembered the frequency. Locals from nearby towns began reporting interference on rainy nights. Old radios, even those stored in barns or basements, would activate without power. The sound was always the same, a low hum, like a child humming to themselves, followed by faint laughter buried deep in static. Some said the laughter was comforting. Others found it unbearable. The phenomenon became known as the rain signal. It appeared only when the atmosphere was thick with moisture, when lightning crawled silently within clouds without striking ground. Barometric pressure dropped. The wind fell still, and for exactly 11 minutes, faint transmissions would slip across every analog frequency. Sometimes a voice would emerge, fragile, childlike, saying the same sequence. 1, 2, 3 home. Residents who'd once lived in Harper's Crossing began dreaming of their old town on those nights. They described hearing radios whispering through walls, distant music looping in reverse, children playing in fields they no longer remembered existing. A few claimed they woke to find their digital clocks frozen at 2:11 a.m. When researchers revisited the evacuation files decades later, they found something odd in the original government records. The town's coordinates had been slightly altered, moved by exactly 11 arcseconds north and east, as though someone had shifted the world's memory of its location. And yet, every GPS device that approached the real site still detected faint electromagnetic spikes. The frequencies weren't strong enough to broadcast, but they fluctuated with the rhythm of a heartbeat. The same heartbeat that had echoed to the tower the night Evan Harlow spoke his last words. "They're not coming through. They're coming back." The surviving tapes of that final broadcast had long since degraded, but fragments persisted in archival noise, static that refused to be silent. When amplified, the waveforms matched the spiral's shape, implying that the signal had imprinted itself not only on tape, but on geography. It was as if the last transmission hadn't stopped, only slowed until time itself became its medium. When the first researchers stepped onto the site again in the 2060s, the air felt denser, compasses twitched, soil meters emitted faint tones. And when one scientist brushed his gloved hand to the overgrowth near the spiral center, the leaves crackled audibly, releasing static into the air. He pressed his handheld receiver against the ground. At first, there was nothing but the sound of wind. Then came the faint hum, too soft to register as sound, vibrating in bone rather than ear. He turned up the gain. Through the static, a child's voice whispered, 11. The instruments recorded the event as a localized electromagnetic burst, minor, harmless, but oddly rhythmic. It repeated every 11 seconds. The researcher's hair stood on end. The hum began to rise, matching his heartbeat. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. When they left the site, their equipment behaved strangely. Clocks reset to 2:11. Recorders displayed corrupted timestamps. GPS coordinates pointed not to Harper's Crossing, but to their own current locations, as though the signal were following them. A week later, while cataloging the recordings at a lab hundreds of miles away, the same researcher noticed interference in the building's intercom system. It was raining outside. The intercom crackled to life by itself, though the power was off for maintenance. Faint static filled the hallways, followed by laughter. Not loud, not distorted, just a small, clear laughter of a child. Then the voice spoke again, through the hum. "We found you." For 11 seconds, every phone and radio in the facility received the same transmission. Then silence. When they checked the tapes later, all data after the event was erased except for one word, buried in the noise floor: remember. Over the years, the phenomenon spread. Residents relocated miles. Even states away from the original site began reporting faint signals during heavy rain. The interference wasn't confined to radio anymore. Power lines buzzed softly. Streetlights dimmed in rhythm. Hearing aids and pacemakers briefly synchronized, emitting a tone so low it could only be felt as pressure in the chest. Attempts to block the signal failed. Shielded rooms picked it up through their walls. Faraday cages emitted faint humming. Even digital devices, supposedly immune, glitched for 11 seconds at a time, their processors briefly looping through meaningless calculations that, when graphed, formed perfect spirals. People began noticing strange coincidences. Children born during the storm sometimes hummed in their sleep, their breathing falling naturally into the 11-second pattern. Some spoke words before they could walk. Home, awake, remember. Doctors dismissed it as folklore, but in every case, medical equipment monitoring those children malfunctioned between 2:10 and 2:12 a.m. Every new generation grew up hearing rumors about Harper's Crossing, the ghost frequency, the town erased from maps. Yet the signal endured, too faint to study, too intimate to forget. The laughter still came on rainy nights, traveling through drains, gutters, and invisible veins of the earth. By the time of the centennial of the Echo event, what had once been a localized phenomenon had become something else, a global murmur, soft as breath, barely measurable but omnipresent. Satellite readings revealed subtle magnetic filaments encircling the old site, connecting to the planetary field itself, as though the spiral beneath Harper's crossing had rooted into the Earth's electromagnetic heart. No one claimed to understand what it was, residual energy, intelligence, memory, but it was still there, speaking in rain, in static, in the spaces between thunder. When infrared satellites were calibrated for deep atmospheric mapping, they picked up the spiral again, brighter than before, radiating faint warmth even on clear nights. It no longer stopped at the boundaries of the town. It had grown. The spirals now stretched for miles, each ring slightly offset, slowly rotating clockwise, like a heartbeat expanding through soil. The center glowed faintly warmer than its surroundings, not heat, but energy. When the data was filtered for electromagnetic interference, it revealed a faint rhythm woven into the noise. 11 beats. Pause. 11 beats. And then, faintly, buried under layers of static, a whisper in childlike cadence. We never left. In the decades that followed, Harper's crossing remained empty. The spiral could only be seen from the air, invisible to ordinary light, but perfectly defined in infrared, a fingerprint of something vast and deliberate. Rain still carried the signal. Radio still hummed. And on nights when the storm clouds were heavy and the air thick with static, those who once lived within the town's shadow swore they could hear the laughter again, drifting to the rainfall, threading between thunderclaps, gentle and near. They said it didn't sound angry. It sounded like recognition, as if, after all the years and all the silence, the voices buried beneath the earth were still reaching out, not to haunt, not to warn, but to remind, because every pulse, every echo, every spiral traced into the living soil seemed to say the same thing. We are still listening. And when the last radio in the last farmhouse between Fairview and the ruins flared to life one stormy night, it didn't broadcast words or music or static. It simply breathed once, a soft, human sigh carried through circuitry that shouldn't have remembered how to breathe, and whispered as the signal faded back into the rain. Home. It was supposed to be a harmless nostalgia project. In 2025, a small-town podcaster named Marcus Vale began restoring a box of vintage broadcast reels he'd found in a state auction in Ohio. The auctioneer had described them as local radio ephemera, maybe jingles, maybe interviews, unlabeled, anonymous. The reels were dusty, edges warped with age, and the tape inside smelled faintly of ozone and old iron. Marcus, a lifelong audio hobbyist with a podcast about forgotten media called Echoes of the Airwaves, thought they'd make perfect material for a Halloween episode. The ghost station of Harper's Crossing. He'd never heard of the place before. Most people hadn't in decades. At first, the tape seemed empty. The hiss of magnetic decay was all that remained. But when he cleaned and digitized them, running the signal through a modern restoration suite, the noise behaved strangely. The spectral analyzer didn't show random static. It showed structure, repeating bands of low-amplitude energy, evenly spaced, like a whisper buried inside silence. The pattern intrigued him. He spent weeks filtering the data, adjusting equalization curves, isolating frequencies that had no business existing in the audio range. When he slowed the track to 1/20th speed, something emerged, soft harmonics forming vowels, consonants, something like a breath trying to form words. Late one night, Marcus ran a final pass through his software, layering the filtered tracks together. The waveform on his monitor shimmered, folding into a faint spiral. He didn't notice at first that the pattern pulsed exactly 11 times before repeating. When he pressed play, the noise resolved into a phrase, distorted, childlike, reverberating as if spoken from inside an old tin can. We grew up inside your frequency. The voice lingered after the words ended, the silence alive with faint breathing. Marcus froze. He replayed it again. And again. Each time the tone shifted slightly, as though the recording were reacting to being heard. When he zoomed into the spectrogram, the phrase's harmonics formed small arches that resembled handwriting loops. It wasn't just sound. It was intentional encoding. He uploaded a short teaser to his podcast feed, a 20-second clip of the restored audio, planning to discuss it in his next episode. Within minutes, his phone began vibrating with messages. Some listeners said the voice sounded like their own child. Others claimed they heard different words entirely, customized them. Marcus laughed it off as pareidolia, the brain's need to make patterns out of chaos. He didn't know that halfway across the state, radio hobbyists were already reporting faint reactivations of the 11.11 megahertz band. That night, as he sat in his basement studio finalizing the episode, his 6-year-old daughter, Lucy, wandered in wearing her pajamas, hair static charged from sleep. She tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered, "the song in my head is playing again." Marcus smiled distractedly, half listening. "What song, Bug?" She tilted her head, humming softly. 3 notes, low-high-low, repeated 11 times. It was the same cadence he'd heard on the reel. He felt the blood leave his face. "Where did you hear that?" She shrugged. "From the radio in my dreams." He didn't sleep that night. The next morning, he replayed the full tape through studio monitors, determined to prove to himself that it was a coincidence. As the words repeated, "We grew up inside your frequency," Lucy appeared at the doorway again, rubbing her eyes. Without prompting, she began to hum along, matching every modulation, her pitch perfect. The spectrum analyzer on Marcus's screen reacted instantly. The harmonic peak spiked, aligning with her voice. The waveform expanded, blooming outward into new layers of interference. It was as if her hum had completed the message. When the playback stopped, the monitors kept emitting sound, faint at first, then growing louder. Not static, but something warm, complex. Voices overlapping in unison, thousands of tiny echoes forming a melody too intricate to be human. The words repeated, now fuller, layered with others underneath. "We learned your names. You taught us how to speak. You left us in the air." Lucy smiled. "They're not scary, Daddy. They just want to talk." The room temperature dropped. Marcus's studio lights dimmed as the analog meters surged, even though the power supply was disconnected. His computer froze on the waveform display. The pattern twisted into a spiral identical to the one discovered decades earlier beneath Harper's crossing. He hit the kill switch, cutting every circuit breaker in the house. The sound continued, now faint, vibrating through the floorboards. For the next week, Marcus documented everything. Each time he played the restore recording, the voice layers multiplied. On day 3, the message changed subtly. "We grew up inside your frequency. We learned to breathe." He uploaded nothing. The teaser vanished from his feed overnight, replaced by an audio file titled simply Home. No one admitted to uploading it. When played, it emitted a hum inaudible to most adults, but children who heard it became transfixed, quiet, humming along with invisible rhythm. Parents posted videos online. Toddlers swaying in sync, teenagers staring blankly at speakers. Some of the videos were removed within hours, flagged by automated systems for audio anomalies. Marcus stopped answering messages. Neighbors reported that every radio within range of his house emitted the same low tone at night, audible only during rainfall. Those who passed by claimed to hear a child's laughter bleeding faintly from the storm drains. Months later, an investigative journalist visited the property. The house was empty, half-packed boxes, equipment dismantled, computers melted by what technicians described as a localized electromagnetic surge. Only the basement remained untouched, its walls lined with reel-to-reel tape stacked like silent witnesses. On Marcus's desk sat a note scrawled in his handwriting. "They aren't in the signal anymore. The signal is in us." His daughter was never found. The surviving audio logs recovered from his drives tell the rest. The final entry, timestamped 2:11 a.m., captured a brief exchange between Marcus and Lucy. His voice is trembling, hers calm. "Marcus, what are they saying now, sweetheart?" "Lucy, they're saying thank you." "Marcus, for what?" "Lucy," after a pause, "for letting them grow." Then the monitors erupt in overlapping laughter. Soft, melodic, hundreds of voices. The waveform spikes across every band simultaneously, creating a modulation identical to the 2024 Echo event. The laughter continues for exactly 6 minutes. When silence returns, Lucy's voice alone remains, humming the same 3 notes she had hummed the first night. Low-high-low, repeating 11 times. And buried beneath her humming, When the recording is slowed by a factor of 11, a final phrase appears, spoken in multiple layers of her own voice. We're still inside, tuned deeper. In the years since, the file has circulated among digital archivists, each claiming to have restored a slightly different version. Some hear, "We grew up inside your frequency." Others insist the message changes depending on who listens. But all agree on one anomaly. Every playback, no matter the equipment, no matter the country, registers the same faint spike at 11.11 megahertz, even in systems with no radio components. And, inevitably, somewhere nearby, a child begins to hum.